Well, how can each of you, who this law costs $1, organize and agitate and be activists to stop this law? If you put 1 hour of your time into trying to stop this law, you are taking a shot at earning $1 an hour. Thrilling. But each of these 100 people, they make $1 million from this law. They'll be happy to spend many hours finding out who the people are who are most needed to pass this law, how to lobby for it effectively, how to market it and fool people. They'll be willing to spend hundreds of thousands to pass the law and still turn a profit. You would have to organize 1% of Brazil. You'd have to organize 2 million people to have the same interest in this law as each one of these people do. And the costs of organizing those people would outweigh every time the benefits of doing it. You could spread Austrian economics to 1 million people in Brazil, and you wouldn't change these basic incentives. So I'm going to argue that what we need are changes in the incentives of systems and not just education. And this is where my sort of original contribution to the field comes in. It is saying, if democracy is a bad product, why don't we have better products? What is it about the government industry that's different from the cell phone industry that makes it so we throw out our cell phones every 2 years, but government only advances occasionally? You know, if you look at government as an industry, it's not just bad, it's terrible, right? Like, even a company with bad customer service usually doesn't murder its customers or steal from them. I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. I think that there are two main characteristics of the industry that make it so anti-innovation. The first is the barrier to entry. A barrier to entry in an industry is, how hard is it to get into the industry? How hard is it to start a new firm? I can start a software company with this laptop. This is enough capital to start a software company. Unfortunately, every bit of land is claimed by some government, and they won't just let you take a little bit to experiment with. So the barrier to entry to the government industry is you basically have to win like a war, an election, or a revolution just to start a new company. Like, that's a ridiculous barrier to entry for an entrepreneur. And barriers to entry are really important. I mean, the first MP3 players weren't made by Apple. They were made by small startups. It tends to be small groups of people who do new, really different things that turn into radical innovation. When you have a high barrier to entry, when it's really hard to enter an industry, you get mostly big companies because only they can afford these barriers. You don't get a lot of small groups trying new things. Let's compare countries by GDP to companies by revenue. The largest company is Royal Dutch Shell with about $460 million a year in revenue. That puts it as larger than about 16 of the 180 countries in the world and smaller than the other 164. So the biggest companies are much smaller than almost all countries. If you have an industry where all of the firms are ridiculously large, of course it doesn't innovate. The other problem with this industry is customer lock-in. And what I mean is, how hard is it for a prospective user of the product to switch from one company to the other? Because the easier it is for you to switch from one company to another, the harder each company will try to compete to get you. Because if they do a good job, better than their competitor, people will switch. But if it's very hard to switch, they have to not only do better than their competitor, they have to do way better than their competitor. Well, what's the cost of switching countries? Some countries don't let you leave. A lot of countries don't let you enter. You've got to leave your house. You've got to pack up your physical things and move them. You may have to learn a new language, find a new job. It's a huge cost. What happens when you have an industry where it's really hard to enter and it's hard for customers to switch? You get something like the operating system industry, where you get a new entry about every 10 years. Microsoft, Apple, Linux. And I'm saying that this has, people blame Windows being bad on Microsoft. What I'm saying is, it has nothing to do with what kind of person Bill Gates is. It And it has nothing to do with what kinds of operating systems are possible. It's just that an operating system is a lot of work, and it comes with a lot of applications. And so in order to make a new one, you have to do the work of writing the new operating system. You need the new computer programs. You need people to get used to the new system. It's a lot of work, and people have trouble switching. They've already bought a whole lot of programs that work on the old system. They don't want to have to go buy a bunch of new programs for the new system. And so we get an industry that has little innovation, that has only a few large firms. Let's compare this to something like the web. You know, for any category of websites, almost any category, there are a ton of different firms. There are a lot of travel websites. There are a lot of photo sharing websites. There are a lot of pornographic websites. For every type of website, people try lots of different things. This is because you can make a new website just with a computer. Let's consider another Microsoft product, the Xbox. All right, the Xbox is a great product. A lot of people are very happy. You know, Microsoft Windows is like been a running joke for 20 years. The Xbox is considered a great product. It comes from the same company, but in a more competitive industry, one that's easier to enter and where people switch what they use more often. And we've seen operating systems get more competitive lately. We've seen services for computers get better, not because, you know, Apple is trying to compete harder, but because more and more things have moved to the web, where your operating system doesn't matter, right? And when we have netbooks, where people say, it runs Linux, whatever, I don't care, you know, I can access my Gmail. So we see things changing not because of the people, not because of the possible technologies, but just the incentives in the industry. So if the problem is we have too many big companies in the government industry, we don't have startups, then the solution is we have to somehow add a startup sector for government. All right, how do we do a government startup which tries some radically different system like anarcho-capitalism? An election doesn't do it. The president can't throw out the entire Constitution. Secession, I mean, secession happens still, and it's good, but when you have a country seceding, it tends, again, to repeat something close to the old political system. I mean, it's a big group, smaller than it was before, and big groups don't try radically new things. War and revolution, you know, maybe if you had a bloody, violent revolution and took over, you could try something really different. You know, we don't have so many wars and revolutions anymore, and that's a really good thing, because most of our governments, even the bad ones, are not so bad that it's worth risking your life for, which is great, because they've gotten better. The old way of trying out a startup government used to be to go someplace unoccupied, to go to the frontier. Being American, I'm most familiar with the example of America. People didn't fix things by having a revolution in Europe or by getting together to try to change the government there. They ran away to a place where there were not entrenched elites, where they had a blank canvas to try something new. And of course the elites followed them and tried to control them, but that distance made that control much harder. They won, you know, they wouldn't have won the, you know, Southwest England Revolution. But they could win the American Revolution because of the distance. Unfortunately, we're out of frontier. Every single rock on the planet is claimed. If it's above the water at high tide, then it extends oil and fishing rights out 200 miles, and so some country has claimed it. So with this framework, the answer becomes obvious. We just need to reopen the frontier by building floating cities, city-states on the ocean. And the goal of this is to transform the entire government industry. The goal of this is not, let's get a bunch of people together who believe the right thing and go form one new society. It's not that at all. We're going to lower the barrier to entry to where maybe tens to hundreds of thousands of people, for a cost of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, could go try out a radically new system of government, where all you have to do to try out something really different is to get that number of people and that amount of money together, which is, you know, not easy to get tens to hundreds of millions, but it's a lot easier than what we have now. But the really interesting part to me is not just how seasteading lowers this barrier to entry, but how it reduces customer lock-in, how it makes it easier to switch providers. This is a picture of the Royal Caribbean Freedom of the Seas and the Empire State Building at the same scale. So this cruise ship, it moves around. It doesn't just move around like as a special, once every century kind of thing. It moves around constantly, all the time. So on the ocean, you can build your city-states out of modular pieces that can be rearranged, where you could leave your country without leaving your house. Or we call it vote with your house. To slightly modify a quote of my dad's from Machinery of Freedom, a seastead city might declare an unpopular war one day, and the leaders would wake up the next morning and find that the only buildings left are the military barracks and the newspaper offices. Everyone else has floated 5 miles away to a city that's almost the same, because they were pretty happy with the rest of the political system, except that it has new leaders who aren't going to declare an unpopular war. And of course, in practice, you probably wouldn't even have to do this. There's a saying in chess that the threat is greater than the execution. When people have the freedom to leave easily, that forces those running the country to do a good job to keep people there. So this vision of seasteading is to lower the barrier to entry and lower the cost of switching which country you're in. The idea is to create Politics 2.0, lots of small government startups that are innovating and competing for customers and trying different things. It's to create a market for government. So we're not just running away and kind of hoping things will be different. Water is a fundamentally different medium than land. It has different characteristics that will lead to a different type of society. Okay, that was a quick version of kind of a big, crazy idea. Some of the implications. People tend to label libertarians or anyone who wants to go try a new society as utopian. There's nothing utopian about competitive government. I'm not saying that I know the best way to run a society. I'm just saying that if a lot of different groups try out their favorite ways of running a society, something's going to work better. This is very scientific. All I'm saying is let's apply the scientific method to government and do more experiments. I mean, it's a measure of just how bad the government industry is that the scientific method is like a radical innovation. People are always going to argue about what rights we should have, about what goals a society should be designed for, but they're going to argue a lot less bitterly if everyone can have what they want. And they shouldn't have to argue about what works and what doesn't. They should try it and find out. The world is complicated, and we can't plan ahead of time what the best rules or institutions for societies are. All we can do is go out and experiment more and find things that work. The best way to change incentives is with technology. In the US in 1968, there was a movement called zero population growth. It said, oh no, overpopulation is coming. We must convince people to have less kids. Whether or not you agree with that logic, what actually made people have less kids was the birth control pill. It may seem roundabout to get freedom by building cities on the ocean. I mean, it does seem roundabout. But the idea is that if we invent a technology, it changes what is possible. And it changes what people do. And that's actually a much better way of changing the world than trying to go out and convince a lot of people to change their behavior. You make them change their behavior with different incentives. And if you come to accept this viewpoint, when you look at political debate, you're going to kind of see it as like a childish tug of war. Like people pulling really hard, fighting bitterly where they disagree the most and getting nowhere. It's like the most work for the least results. I want to find ways where we can pull sideways on this rope. Do things that not convince people who really strongly believe that something else is the right way, that your way is best, but just gather the people who believe in your way and go out and do it.